Hello, it's your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly Podcast. Today I'm joined again by Brenton Lengel. Today we're going to have a discussion, at least starting with the topic of religion. So why don't you open up for us, Brent?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who don't know, I was born and raised in a Catholic family, standard Roman Catholic. And then I spent some time in and around the United States. I spent a long period in the Bible Belt in South Central Kentucky. And that had an interesting effect on me. And then went to New York, spent some time as a very frustrated atheist, and then kind of moved beyond that. And for the last, since 2014, so the last 5 years, I have been a Nichiren Buddhist with Soka Gakkai International, which is the world's largest lay Buddhist organization. We're in 192 countries, do a lot of work with the UN, and was until very recently a men's leader in Harlem. In New York City, but I've recently moved out, so I need to reconnect with the organization once I settle. As you guys can see, I'm not in my normal spot. I'm actually staying with a friend in Manhattan right now because I need to be in there for some work stuff and also some karate stuff. So, I don't have my regular AV setup, so if anything comes through strangely, that's why.
Yeah, well, I guess just to give a brief breakdown of my religious upbringing, it was fairly conventional Christian fundamentalist. As far as the core elements of Christian fundamentalism, I would still adhere to those. But I think a lot of the cultural trappings that one often associates with Christian fundamentalism isn't necessarily what you necessarily have to hold, because the fundamentalist is just basically the virgin birth, the historical Jesus, the resurrection of the dead, is basically a development to challenge liberal theologians who are arguing that this stuff was allegorical or symbolic. And whether you support the Republican Party or the invasion of Iraq isn't necessarily a requirement for the fundamentalist core doctrine. And in that sense, I would say I'm still a fundamentalist because I accept the core doctrines, even if I've taken other aspects that will put me outside of the subculture and other aspects. So I think that's probably the best breakdown for where I stand. Now, I remember, Brenton, one time we had a discussion. The last major discussion we had was about, I think it was right versus left or conservative versus socialist or something like that, very, very broad and sweeping. And you had mentioned you wanted to have a discussion about Buddhism and Christianity. I thought that sounds like an interesting idea. So one thing, I guess, to get out of the way, and not that either one of us would pull this stunt, but the idea that we have had in the past, historical governments that are tyrannical or authoritarian that have used the label of Christianity. For example, your own religion of Nichiren Buddhism was hijacked by the Japanese imperialists. And there are many Nichiren Buddhists who supported the Japanese imperialist position all the way from 1870 to World War II. And so it's not that, I think we can agree that religion tends to be corrupted by interference by the state. And that's what brings up the worst elements of the religions that are already there.
I would agree with that entirely. And yes, there are a number of Nichiren sects that were kind of pulled into the Japanese fascism. And what's interesting, the founder of Soka Gakkai he actually died in a Japanese prison during World War II because he refused to recognize the Japanese emperor as a living god. And other sects or other groups within the Nichiren sect kind of just went for that hook, line, and sinker. Religion can easily get hijacked by politics. I think a lot of the time, because religion has such a strong cultural and emotional pull on humans, it can be used to mobilize populations for good and for evil. One of the things that I've said about religion that I've noticed about it is that everybody likes to act like they follow the rules, like their sect. But I've really noticed that just about everybody just sort of picks and chooses at all times. I sort of see it kind of as, I guess, like sometimes your faith is not just an outgrowth of what has come before and your religious tradition, but it's also an aspect. It becomes an expression of your own internal reality and of your own heart, wherever your heart is. So the expression, if you're in a very negative headspace, can be incredibly negative and evil. And if you're in a better headspace, with the same basic sect, the same basic beliefs, can come out in a very positive way.
Exactly. Now, I don't remember exactly, but I remember when I used to read a lot about samurai, they would ultimately, the peak samurai period is when you get the late 16th and early 17th century, when you get the Jesuit missions. And this may not have been Nichiren Buddhism, but I remember there was a strain of Buddhism that the Jesuit missionaries thought was the worst kind of paganism because it was so close to Christianity that it kind of sniped their audience, because you had to rely on someone else as a savior to save you. It wasn't Christ. It was some other like Buddhist, ascended being. And they were so mad that these Buddhists sort of like sniped their audience. Was that Nichiren Buddhism?
Well, it wouldn't be Nichiren Buddhism, because Nichiren Buddhism was the 13th century. If you're talking about a specific savior being, it was probably Pure Land Buddhism.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, which for the record, Nichiren had a lot of issues with them as well.
Yeah, but you see, what's interesting about Buddhism, at least with the Buddha, and also with one of the similarities with Christianity, unlike other prophets who tend to be more warrior prophets like Muhammad or Moses or other religions, Buddha and Jesus are typically seen as pacific or pacifist prophets. Mm-hmm. But we also see that, just like in Christianity, a similar trend happened in Buddhism, where you end up with, Buddhist warrior monks in Japan. Buddhism is a state religion of China and forced to the point of the sword, which again is probably not what the Buddha wanted, just like the same way Christ probably didn't want the Crusades or the Inquisition. But it's interesting that there seems to be this similar parallel, where you have this more peaceful prophet, and then his centuries down the road, his interpretations are changed to suit the needs of existing power structures.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got it right there. It's needs of existing power structures. I think it is very interesting that you did have that. You also have the inverse of it. For instance, in Tibet, when Buddhism came to Tibet, the Tibetans prior to that were actually known as the Red Faces, and they would descend from the mountains in much the same way that Vikings would, sail in on their ships and raid the surrounding areas in India and China. And they may have actually gone on to conquer large portions of China had they not become Buddhists. And then later on, when the Mongols were first invading, one of the first Dalai Lama actually went and converted the Khan to Buddhism. And there was a long period where Tibet enjoyed a very long reign of peace and stability, specifically because the Mongols defended them militarily, and they provided the Mongols with spiritual insights. So, once again, it can go either way oftentimes. But yeah, I agree with the point.
Well, and to sort of make an analogy in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, the Northmen, you mentioned the Vikings specifically, were extremely brutal and savage, raiding all along the Western European seaboard, as far south as Cordoba and the Caliphate, and as far east as Byzantium and Persia through the Russian rivers. And it's interesting as well that or even the Irish, who were slavers, they captured Patrick famously. So we do see that same reverse effort, where the Irish and the Scots and the Vikings, who are rather brutal invaders and slavers and raiders, were pacified, to a degree that you wouldn't imagine, 100 years earlier. So it is kind of a two-way system, and it sort of depends on various factors. And one of the elements, too, that, at least from, it's all well known, the state socialists' degradation of Christianity in Eastern Europe and Russia. But in the East, in Mongolia, China, Vietnam, there was tremendous repression there as well. I mean, in 1900, Buddhism was like the world's fourth largest religion. And then by the end of the century, it had shrunk to like the 10th. So, the state atheism did Buddhism no favors either. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, you're right. It totally didn't. It's actually interesting in the 19th century. And I think what's very interesting about that is the sort of migration of secularized Judeo-Christian values into China via Marxism is sort of what got them in that situation. You had Marx's The Opium of the Masses, and I think he is a lot of times very misquoted with how that comes across, especially today. But, obviously the Chinese Communist Party took that very much at face value. There's an Alan Watts lecture, a really great one that I highly recommend people check out, especially if you're coming from a Western Christian, Judeo-Christian background and you're wanting to sort of understand Eastern religion and Buddhism in particular. And he talked about how, and also, kind of like the new atheist movement and where this sort of secularized ideology came from. But what he talks about in this particular lecture, and I think you'll find it on YouTube, like On the Nature of God, Alan Watts, it came from this idea that there have been two dominant mythologies in the West. The first one is the standard traditional Christian mythology. And then what happened with that to a certain extent, because the church became so heavily intertwined with the state throughout the Middle Ages, that one, you had all of these religious wars, the Huguenots, the Spanish Inquisition, all that kind of thing between European nations that had to be dealt with. But also there was sort of the psychological level that there was almost a, how do I describe this? Throughout the theologians, there came sort of the idea of God as kind of omnipotent and omnipresent. And when that came into effect, you had the implication of an all-seeing eye. Christopher Hitchens famously called God like North Korea forever because of the sort of big brother implication. And I don't think that was really present in early Christianity. I don't think that's part
Just to intersect real quick, I find it hilarious that he is an atheist has to say that God is an atheist dictator.
Yeah, that's really funny. I hadn't thought of that.
I missed something there, Chris. But
yeah. No, you're totally right. And so what happened was people had this kind of conception of ultimate reality of the universe where it was too intelligent. And we had there's a lot of guilt baked into a lot of traditional Christian upbringing, the idea that you're falling so far short of the example of Jesus, and that you are a sinner, and at any moment you deserve to go to hell except for the grace of God. Kind of the idea that if you are a child of God, you're not really one of the family, you're a child by adoption and grace. And to a certain extent, Watts talks about this. It's like a lot of people couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand the idea that they were being watched constantly by this being that was judging them. And they're told that he loves them, but also that without that love, they're completely and utterly unworthy. So it creates this kind of psychological crisis where they respond to it by dreaming up an idea of the mechanic universe, the mechanistic, the hard materialism. And that sort of became the ideology of the communists and honestly the new atheists to a certain extent, in the idea that the world is just material. It is just dumb, blind energy, and humans and the human heart and human consciousness, it's all a very sophisticated expression of that blind energy. So you can see that what we have here is we have one idea about humanity that becomes popular, followed by a couple of major political shifts, and certain people misunderstanding various doctrines and their place in the universe, followed by a complete and utter rejection of that. And in a lot of ways, the rejection is so much of an overcorrection that it leads to, ironically enough, a huge crackdown on religion in the East, which doesn't have that whole idea. What's very interesting is that, like in a Western concept, a child will say to their parent, like, how was I made? And it makes sense that a child would say that because we're in a technologically driven culture where we oftentimes will inadvertently think about like humans spontaneously appearing in the universe, either through a fluke or being created by a higher being. And that ties into the fact that we're a culture that makes things. We make machines, and we even have this whole idea of like the soul and the self as a tiny little man that hides inside and pilots our entire body. In the East, they don't really have that conception. It's more along the lines of a child would ask their parents, how did I grow? The human and the consciousness that is within the human is not, there's no actual separation there. And rather than being something that is almost foreign to existence, we are actually a vital part of existence. The ocean waves and the earth peoples. Like we are a function of this entire environment. So it's like the Enlightenment anti-religious push was picked up by the Marxists, taken to Asia, and then imposed upon a religion that ironically didn't have this. It was a reaction to something that was not inherent in their culture.
Yeah. Now, what I would argue is a couple of points is if you look at, and you even mentioned this earlier on in the monologue there, that a lot of this is not really organic to Christianity. The idea of the ghost in the machine is really Greek. You know, you read Plato, and he's like, we're this ghost in a prison, and so with Christianity, when it comes out, it's the body. This body is good, right? Because one of the early heresies was Gnosticism, which said the body was evil, which either led to asceticism or hedonism. And so, what I think in part happened, especially if you look at the more like what we call low churches, like maybe not Baptist, but like the Anabaptists, the Quakers, and other groups, they tend to not have that sort of domineering, you can never make God happy attitude. I think that's in part the derivative of the state alliance structure that they were a part of going back so long, because that's how the authoritarian state operates. There's this all-powerful person at the top, the emperor, the god king, and he wants to make sure that everybody does what he does. So we see this very clearly, right? Because when Constantine converts to Christianity, we see that the icons of Christ look just like Zeus, from 100 years ago. And Christ is sort of seen as a Roman emperor figure. So Christ becomes the Roman emperor and then takes on all of the negative traits of the Roman emperor. And even after the Roman Empire falls, that's how Christ is seen, because of this alliance with state power and the sort of Platonic worldview. Because with the ancient Greco-Roman worldview, you have this idea of centralizing power into the one. You have the one king that rules over everything, and that was, of course, copied from the East, from Egypt and Iran and Iraq. And so what ends up happening is it comes to Rome, and at that time, when they accept Christianity, sort of, that's how you get this kind of religion. And I think when you sort of start shedding those sort of negative aspects that we associate with Christianity go away. The other thing that was a driving force to the split was that the church said one thing and did exactly the opposite. It said, be humble, be charitable, be chaste, and they're hoarding money, they're visiting brothels, they're being as uncharitable as possible to all their opponents. And so the people are like, well, you say we should do this, and we agree that we should be doing this, but you're not. And you're not allowing us to do it because you call us heretics. And what's interesting here is if you look at Peter Marshall's book, Demanding the Impossible, he does trace the lineage of anarchist political thought to, in some sense, the radical Reformation. And that's more of the tradition that I come from. And so we also see that even Marxists like Kautsky points out that not just Munster, which is maybe the worst example to use because it was so tyrannical and authoritarian, but other groups as well, he admits, we see these beginnings of these signs that socialists would later adopt for themselves.
Yeah, I think there was a Kurt Vonnegut novel. I'm forgetting which one it was, but Bless You, Mr. Goldwater. And he is Mr. Goldwater, the character, not Barry Goldwater, but the character in the book, is accused at one point of being a Marxist because he's doing all of this charitable work. And he actually said, he says, well, you can't be interested in helping the poor and not, bump into Marx, and also you can't be accused of wanting to help the poor and not bump into Jesus Christ. And there's even there's a quote from the Bible. I forget exactly where it's from, but like you can find it, like Google like communist Jesus, and there's this whole bit where they talked about how the apostles after Christ held everything in common and had people like sell parcels of their land and then bring the money from the sale to the community to be used by everybody. And like one family like held back some of the money that they'd kept, and the priests, it says in the book that the priests confronted him with this, or the apostles confronted him, and he and his wife both died of shame. So, there's definitely it's like there's two currents within Christian theology, and some people actually tie that back to Paul. I don't know enough about it to know if that's like really where it goes, because from what you're telling me, a lot of it becomes the Greeks and also input from the Iranians, the Persian Empire at the time. And it's also very interesting, like when you sit in church, especially like a Catholic church really does seem to be based after the political structure of the Middle Ages. And a lot of the Protestant churches I've seen almost seem based after court structures. So like, you've got the priest up in the front. He's up there where God would be. He's above everybody. His back is to the back of the room because you can't be stabbed in the back if your back is to there, and people have to come in and kneel because obviously they can't attack you when they're kneeling. So there are all of these kinds of little extra trappings and cultural things that have come into various religions that are mainly an effect of the political structure echoing itself. I mean, if you notice, even like with Buddha, like there's a ton of Buddha statues where his back is to the wall.
Well, I mean, looking at how, the power structure can appropriate this, Empress Wu is notorious for her persecution of the Confucians. And since they were the literati class, her reputation has not suffered so well in succeeding centuries. But this is the same kind of persecution.
Oh, sorry. Same thing with the Vikings and the fact that they were raiding the only people who could write.
Well, that's one of the hazards, right? You go after the people that can write. But what's interesting is if you look at what I would argue the Radical Reformation, despite some of the excesses like Munster, was a more pure expression of the gospel and what we saw in the early church and the early centuries of the church. But in a nutshell, the TLDR would be the church started making a lot of mistakes. The first mistake was making peace with the power of Rome itself. Because ultimately the gospel is subversive of this sort of state authority. And then the second mistake was using Greek concepts, because one of the problems with Greek philosophy, or Greek ethics even, is that their term for justice was diakosune, and justice meant for them sort of an abstract concept. And we see this most perfectly in Plato's Republic. And of course, lying is not incompatible with justice, because in order to create the just city, you have to lie with the four orders of men based on the metals. So lying is acceptable with justice in order to create this abstract system. But you don't actually have to, it's said, because it is an abstract system, they're not as concerned about implementing it. So we see, even with the Stoics, one of the more, I think, advanced Greek moralists, their entire principle was, indifference. You don't let the outside world affect you because you can't affect it. Whereas the Jewish view, which then gets translated into Christianity, is tzedek, which means righteousness. And righteousness is different than justice in this sense. Righteousness is not an abstract concept. It is the actual implementation of God's will for the world in the present through the doing of good deeds. And so that's why we see, the plight of the poor and widows and orphans in the ancient world was horrific. I mean, if you were an orphan in ancient Rome, you had pretty much three options. You died of exposure, you became a slave, or you became a prostitute. That was it. And probably dying of exposure was the least bad of the three options. Whereas the orphans, the most you could expect as an orphan would be having state. If your father had died serving the state, then they might take care of you. But other than that, forget it. Going back to the Old Testament, God says, widows and orphans. David says, I always protected widows and orphans. You don't see Nebuchadnezzar or, Hammurabi saying that. And so with Christianity, now that it's no longer an ethnic religion, it's a universal religion, we then apply these principles. So the Roman Empire is kind of a mixed blessing here, right? Because now that we're not being killed anymore, we can build hospitals, which Christians do. And then you can build universities, which Christians do. But then the trade-off is that Christianity loses some of its radical elements by co-opting with the state system. But just think about that. Like, for the first time in the Roman Empire, or anywhere in the world, you had a widespread hospital system by the end of the 4th century. And even if the methods were crude, it turns out that even in the 1st century, most people died due to neglect. I mean, just giving people food and water and clothing is enough to keep many people alive in a famine or a disaster situation. And the pagans would always run away from famines, plagues, and disasters, and the Christians would run in. And they're like, "You're crazy. Why are you doing this?" And, the pagan emperor Julian, the apostate, said, "We can't beat the Christians. They do all this wonderful charity. The poor love them." And so he tried to create his own pagan version, and that didn't work very well. So we do see that the key difference is that the Greeks, it's an abstract principle that you should, in theory apply, but there's really not a lot of pressure to do that. And the more that Greek influence takes over, we see that there's less of an incentive. So give you a practical example. In the Belgian Congo, which was one of the most horrific atrocities in the 19th century, the Catholic Church was pretty silent on the matter. It was evangelicals from the United States that blew the lid off this in the 1880s and 1890s, because evangelicals had more of a Hebraic mindset where you have to implement God's justice. And that, of course, within the U.S. context, in the English context, led to a lot of reforms for prisons, for poor people, for working class people, for debtors. And so because you have, or for Russia, for example, Richard Pipes, the Reagan advisor on Russia, in his book, Russia Under the Tsar, he says that the Orthodox Church by the 19th century was completely blind to the plight of the poor. And the Orthodox Church was literally the only institution that could have galvanized the poor against state communism. And they just totally ignored them. And he's like, there's no church in the history of the world that's been so callous to the plight of the poor. And again, they were thoroughly inundated by Greek philosophy, the imperial ethos, and they'd become Caesar rather than, being the light in the dark.
Which is really interesting when you contrast that with Jesus and the figure of Jesus, particularly like how that works with the Romans. What I find interesting is this kind of plays to a specific Buddhist concept, which is the idea of fundamental darkness. So sort of like without getting too horribly into the weeds, and we can get into the weeds later because I find it fascinating, the essential way that Buddhists see the universe, it's not like there is like an individual soul within each human being, an animal and stuff, and they jump from body to body and they get little karmic points stuck to them. And, if you get enough good karmic points, you go up. And if you get enough bad karmic points, you go down. That's kind of a holdover from Hinduism, which Buddhism evolved out of. And that was really more a justification for the Hindu caste system. The way the Buddhists look at things is that there is no actual self. There is no eternal soul for an individual. Instead, what we are is, you can think of it as either no soul, or you can think of it as one giant soul that is constantly reincarnating into literally everything that there is. So there is no actual separation between me, you, the computer, the table, the cat in the other room. It's all the same. It just appears to be different because of Maya, which is illusion, which is not to say that it's a trick, but more, we're in this particular formation of atoms that's causing this particular consciousness to appear in my brain right now that gives me a very specific perspective related to consciousness. But wait 70, 80 years, that perspective's gone, but the energy in the atoms and everything that was in my body still remain. And then it eventually takes another form. So the concept of fundamental darkness is the tendency of conscious beings to forget the interconnectedness of all phenomena. And to begin to think that the actual reality is the reality that we experience in our minds from our perspective, and that I am only Brent, and I am only this tiny thing that popped up out of the universe, will experience life for a certain amount of years, and then will vanish either into a afterlife or into nothing, and they shut you up in a black box forever. That's fundamental darkness. Now, the reason I'm tying this into what you mentioned about the tendency of religion to collaborate with the state, and particularly what happened to the Russian Orthodox Church, is when your mind is in the grip of fundamental darkness. And everybody deals with this. This is a constant thing within just human psychology and probably all forms of psychology. What happens is because you forget that you are connected to everything, and you start thinking of yourself only as this tiny piece, you begin to think, how can I gain from this? How can I live the best possible life and make me and mine do better than everyone else? And you get the idea that you can escape karma, and the ends justify the means, because they do justify the means for this one consciousness, but they don't as you extrapolate out to what people actually are. So oftentimes when you have and what's very interesting, honestly, is the Zen Buddhists who went fascist during World War II, or, the other members of the Nichiren sect, really what's happening is that their brains are getting snared in a very specific psychological trap. It is fundamental darkness. It is an aspect of the devil king of the sixth heaven, which is essentially the Nichiren Buddhist version of the devil. Another name for it really might be Mara.
Yeah. Now, the one thing, did you ever read Scott Adams' God's Debris? Okay.
Yeah, no, I haven't.
Yeah, because what's interesting is, it's just as a side note, is that in his account, God destroyed himself so that he could know the particularities of himself, so that when he reassembled himself, he'd learn something new. That seems to be a theme in a lot of Eastern religion, that the particularity of the world we live in now is, in the sense, God disassembling himself so that when he's reassembled, he can then know something new about himself. And that cycle just continues on for all eternity. Would that be fair to say that that's part of Buddhist philosophy, theology?
I mean, it is, in the sense that it kind of fits into it. But okay. So if you ever read the Upanishads, or the Upanishads, depending upon how you want to pronounce it, it's one of the early, it was a commentary on the Vedas. It's an early Hindu text. They go through a story of creation about the universe. It's over and over and over again, and it's different stories about the same event. The idea that you learn as you're reading the Upanishads is you're not supposed to take it literally. These are fantastical metaphors for what actually happened. And my favorite one, the one that always sticks with me, is the story of death. And the way it goes is, first there was death. And death said, I am death, let me equip myself with a body. And then death proceeded to create children. And the whole purpose of creating the children was for death to eat death's own children, to feed itself, because it's death, and that's what death does. Now, the story right there is essentially giving the idea that in the beginning, everything was one. There was no separation. And then at some point, this one became aware of itself. Well, once you're aware of yourself, self implies other. So then, boom, everything splits in two. And then that splits, and that splits, and that splits. And the force of death and the force of entropy is returning it to that state of oneness. But of course, if it happened once and split once, it will split again for all eternity. And so, you kind of get that concept of the wheel of samsara and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, which Buddhists are kind of trying to get off the ride in a lot of them. Now, what's interesting, though, is a lot of Westerners think by trying to get off the ride, Buddhists are trying to, and some Buddhist sects, especially early Theravada Buddhists, when they were looking for enlightenment, looking for moksha, they sort of did have this idea that they would be essentially removed from the cycle of birth and death. What's very interesting is if you read later works, particularly the Lotus Sutra, which is the central text for Nichiren Buddhism,
Oh, we're losing you there, Brett.
Oh, what would you lose?
You just mentioned the sect, and then I didn't hear anything else.
The sect. Which sect? Like, what is? Can you go back a little bit, because I don't even remember saying the sect.
Okay, well, maybe that's how it sounded when you cut out. Just repeat the last 30 seconds of what you said.
Oh, okay. The sect of Theravada Buddhists. They sort of had this idea that was what they were looking to do, was to essentially escape the cycle of birth and death. But if you go to my central text, the Lotus Sutra, it actually explicitly says in the 16th chapter that there is no cycle of birth and death. And essentially, enlightenment, what we're pushing for, is not so much to not exist, but rather to not be fooled. And it goes up back almost to Buddha when he was initially enlightened under the Bodhi tree. He's sitting there under the tree, and the demon Mara appears to him and first sends armies after him. And the Buddha turns the armies into flower petals, because that's amazing. And then Mara sends his daughters to try to tempt the Buddha. And the whole time,
Avatar should have ended.
Yeah. How what should have ended?
Avatar. That's what Yang should have done.
That would have been amazing, yeah. Or Game of Thrones. Turn the White Walkers into flowers. But Buddha, he sits underneath the Bodhi tree in this very specific position, where with one arm up and the other hand down on the earth, and he just says, "I see you, Mara." And it's basically being like, okay, I know the game you're playing here. It's not working anymore, because I figured out the actual reality.
Yeah, I think this is actually probably the key dividing line between Christianity and but not just Buddhism, but also ancient paganism, because even in European paganism, there is this sort of polytheist or pantheist substrate. Like even Plato and the Stoics, even though they personify deities, well, maybe not Plato, because God is the one. But again, with emanations coming out of it, that seems very similar to Buddhism. There's this one ultimate reality, and things emanate out of it. Whereas there's this balance that Christianity walks between the immanence of God and the transcendence of God. So the transcendence of God is found in the opening chapters of the Bible. That in the beginning there was just God. There was nothing else but him. And then he creates the universe. So it's not a part of him. It wasn't created from some pre-existing material, and it wasn't created from him. It's something else. But also, he's immanent in it, because ultimately the whole story of salvation is God sending his son to save creation. Not just humanity, of course, that's the crown of creation, but creation itself, as we read in Romans 8. So what we end up having is kind of, sometimes God is too transcendent, like in the medieval scholastics or in Calvinist theology. It's almost like, why do we even have God in the first place? If he's so unknowable, so ineffable. And in fact, that's one of the problems the Eastern Orthodox pointed out. They're like, you Western Christians, you gave rise to atheism because God was so ineffable, he might as well not even exist. But then I think the Orthodox ran into the problem of making God too immanent, where it tends to be more like an Eastern religion. And it's a hard balance, but that's sort of the balance that Christianity has to strike, because God is distinct from the created world, but he's also immanent in it in certain aspects. Now, because I think even in the Psalms it says, if God were to withdraw his essence into himself, all of existence would end. Now, one interesting application of this is Lynn White, a medieval scholar in the 1960s, wrote an essay called The Origins of Our Current Ecological Plight, where he argues that it was the transcendence of God that gave rise to the modern scientific industrial society. Because if the gods were immanent in creation, if they were sacred, like, the sacred groves or the sacred places, you wouldn't want to exploit them. You might incur the wrath of deities. And most people didn't want to do that. But if the world itself is not indwelt by the gods or sacred in some sort of divine sense, it opens up the possibility for scientific development. Now, he thought it was not such a good thing. I'm sure a lot of people think it's a good thing now. But that's one of the effects of the transcendence of God in actual practice. People believe now that they can use nature to serve their needs. We see this in the dominion mandate of Genesis 1. And so that's radically different. And that's not to say that other religions, other empires did not exploit nature. Obviously, the Romans did. Famously, they hunted the fauna of North Africa to extinction, the Barbary bear, elephant, and lion. But, there's a certain scientific precision now to it, which has both good and bad elements. And I think one of the aspects, the less desirable aspects of industrial exploitation, is even though the Greeks, with their immanent view of God, were unable to get to that point, because a lot of these Christians have adopted Greek thinkings of justice, they don't seem to realize or be as concerned about the fallout. So again, to make a distinction, if you look at the treatment of animals, animal welfare in medieval Europe, with the exception of certain saints like St. Francis, or after the Reformation in Catholic Europe and in Eastern Orthodox Europe, animals are treated pretty badly. And even in England, they're treated pretty badly. But the first group of people that articulate a rational first principles justification for treating animals with any consideration were the Puritans, both in England and the United States. And so one of the things that they did is they wanted to outlaw bear baiting, hunting as a sport. I mean, if you need to eat and you're on the frontier, fine. But for the nobles and the kings to just slaughter animals for sport, that was out too. And again, we see that because they're taking more seriously the Hebraic concept of tzedek, where you have to have, because basically if we take the Garden of Eden analogy, this is a garden and we're supposed to take care of it. You don't trash the garden and then when the master comes back and he's like, oh yeah, we burned everything down, polluted it, he's not going to be happy. And so I would argue that one aspect is this Greek aspect that sort of hijacked a lot of Christianity, because the same sort of ruthless Roman extirpation of all this animal life we see in, with some of these other groups in the more modern age. And then we see capitalism align with utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is notorious for, justifying the exploitation, not just of animals, but of humans. The slave trade and all that stuff is justified with utilitarianism. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. And so I think the more that Christians accept, secular or the power structures ideas, they become less concerned about these issues of justice. And when they refocus, then you see the fruit of that. And so, like, for example, a lot of people, they'll say a lot of the labor reforms were due to Christian activities. So, for example, William James Bryan, who is, by today's standards, would be considered a young earth creationist fundamentalist because of his work in the Scopes trial, was also one of the most outspoken labor reformers in the United States, one of the most radical reformers there were at the time. And we also see with Huey Long in Louisiana, his Christian faith also inspired him as well. And so these aspects of trying to make the world more just is the best expression of those Christian elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you actually mentioned, or maybe it was the distributionist, that the concept of, like, the actual word social justice originated within the Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think it was the liberation theology.
Well, it was 19th century Jesuits, yeah.
Well, there you go. What's really interesting, because you talked about Jesus as an emanation of God, and various levels of different belief structures that are playing into it. And what I found actually really interesting is that since I have really gotten into Nichiren Buddhism, and I sat down and read the Lotus Sutra, which was a bit of a chore. I mean, it's an excellent book. I love it, but also, good Lord, is it long at times. There's one of the central parts of it is the 16th chapter, which is the lifespan chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is where Shakyamuni Buddha, it's written from his perspective, and it's supposedly the final sermon he taught before he died. Or he didn't actually die. Spoiler. But in the Lotus Sutra, he actually says to them specifically, hang on, because I pulled this up here. At the time, the Buddha said to the multitude of great bodhisattvas, "Good men, now I will state to you clearly, suppose all the worlds receive..." I started too early. Hang on. Here we go. And just for background, a bodhisattva is a Buddha emanation. It is a Buddha who returns. After achieving enlightenment, they actually continue to be reborn in order to guide others to enlightenment. It's seen as the ultimate kind of situation for a Mahayana Buddhist, which is one of the two major strains of it. So here we go. At this time, the world honored one, which is title of the Buddha, seeing that the bodhisattvas repeated their request 3 times and more, spoke to them saying, "You must listen carefully and hear the thus comes one's secret to his transcendental powers. In all the worlds and the heavenly and human beings and all sutras, all believe that the present Shakyamuni Buddha, after leaving the palace of the Shakyas, seated himself in his place of practice not far from the city of Gaya, and there attained a Natura Samkhya Sambodhi, basically the enlightenment, a final perfect enlightenment. But good men, it has been immeasurable, boundless, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, millions of nuchas of kalpas. Kalpa is the Buddhist word for a really long time, since I, in fact, attained Buddhahood. Suppose a person were to take 500, 1,000, 10,000, a millionfold worlds and grind them all to dust. Then, moving eastward, each time he passes 500, 1,000, 10,000, a million worlds, and he drops a particle of dust. He continues eastward in this way until he has finished dropping every particle. Good men, what is your opinion? Can the total number of these worlds be imagined or calculated? And the Buddhas are like, no, they absolutely cannot. They are immeasurable and boundless. At the time, the Buddha said to the great multitude of bodhisattvas, "Good men, now I will state this to you clearly. Suppose all these worlds, whether they receive a particle of dust or not, are once more reduced to dust, and let one particle represent one kalpa. The time that has passed since I attained Buddhahood surpasses this by 100, 1,000, 10,000, a million kalpas. Ever since then, I have been constantly in this Saha world," Saha being material reality, "preaching the law, teaching and converting. And elsewhere, I have led and benefited living beings in hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, millions of lands. Good men, during that time, I have spoken about the Buddha burning torch in others and described how they have entered nirvana. All of this I employed as an expedient means to make distinctions," which is basically says he lied. "Good men, if there are living beings who come to me, I employ my Buddha eye and observe their faith to see if their faculties are keen or dull. And then depending upon how receptive they are to salvation, I appear in different places and preach to them under different names and describe the length of time in which during my teachings will be effective. Sometimes I make my appearance and say that I am about to enter nirvana, and also employ different expedient means to preach the subtle and wonderful law, thus causing living beings to awaken joyful minds. Good men, the thus come one observes how among living beings there are those who delight in the meager law and meager in virtue, heavy in defilement. And for such persons, I describe as how in my youth I left my household and attained enlightenment. But in truth, the time since I attained Buddhahood is extremely long, as I have told you. The scriptures expound by the thus come one." Hang on, I'm going to skip forward. Here we go. This is what I was going to. By the thus come one are all for the purpose of saving and emancipating living beings. Sometimes I speak of myself, sometimes of others. Sometimes I present myself, sometimes others. Sometimes I show my own actions and sometimes those of others. All that I preach is true and not false. Why do I do this? The thus come one perceives the true aspect of the threefold world exactly as it is. There is no ebb or flow of birth and death. There is no existing in this world and later entering extinction. It is neither substantial nor empty, neither consistent nor diverse, nor is it what those who dwell in the threefold world perceive it to be. All things the thus come one sees clearly and without error. Because living beings have different natures, different desires, different actions, and different ways of thinking and making distinctions, and because I want to enable them to put down good roots, I employ a variety of causes and conditions, similes, parables, and phrases, and preach different doctrines. All of this is the Buddha's work, for which I have never neglected, not even for a moment. Now, that was a long explanation, so I appreciate you sitting through it. But the point being is there's actually a very strong case to be made that Jesus was a bodhisattva. That if you look at things from a Buddhist perspective, that the Christ and also probably a number of other prophets were emanations of this ultimate reality, emanations of God, meeting people where they were at the time, and teaching them, giving them a teaching which was considered potentially expedient means, which is expedient means. I mentioned it earlier, and it's sort of the idea of, imagine like you're a father, you've got a bunch of sons, they're in a house catches fire. They don't know what fire is. You can't run in there and say, oh my God, guys, the house is on fire. So what you do is you say to the sons, hey, you see that door over there? You're playing with these toys now that you love. There's toys just like those outside, but they're way better. And they all get up and run out of the house, and the house burns down, and they're like, hey, Dad, what the hell? You lied to us. Well, did he really lie? Yes, but in order to bring them closer to the actual truth, which was get out of the house, it's burning down. I don't know. That was a long thing, so I appreciate you bearing with me for that. But I found that was one of the really incredible things about the Lotus Sutra and why it was so important to Buddhist doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Seems like everybody wants a piece of Jesus. But,
yeah.
I'm not sure where I let you have him yet. But one of the other things that
I should add, just really quickly, I don't think it's so much taking a piece of Jesus. I would say it's more interpolating Jesus through a Buddhist lens.
Yeah.
You could just as easily go Christian or a Judeo lens.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I touched on briefly at the beginning of this is, if you look at the 20th century, for both Christianity and Buddhism, it was the century of martyrs, probably tens of millions of martyrs. In Buddhism, it's going to be in Russia with the Kalmucks, Mongolia, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And then for Christianity, Eastern Europe, Russia, the Asia Minor, Turkey. You know, everybody remembers the Armenian genocide, but nobody remembers the Greek genocide. You know, Mustafa Kemal finished the genocide of the Greeks, killing a comparable number of people that the Young Turks during World War I had killed of Armenians, completely expelling them from homes they lived in for thousands of years. And then with the rise of radical Islam in the 1970s and 80s, we've seen a revival of persecution from another quarter of Christians. One of the worst contemporary genocides was in Sudan. And it was primarily a Muslim Sudanese government against the Christian South. And we see that largely the media doesn't cover either group. Now, I think in the case of the Buddhists, it might be because, well, that's over there in Asia. We don't really know a lot about Asia. So we're just going to kind of out of sight, out of mind. Now, in the case of the Christians in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, I think it's a bit more nefarious because we know they've been there for a very long time. And there's really no excuse to not covering it. So, for example, we have lots of Holocaust Memorial Days in museums and movies and books. There's hardly any movies and books about, you know, priests and nuns and Christian lay people being murdered by, you know, the Soviet Union, communist governments, Nazi regime, or the Young Turks. And again, with the exception of Armenia, because Armenia does get some coverage for the genocide there.
Well, I love how there's a liberal network called the Young Turks, named after people who literally genocided. Like that's like if Breitbart went and created their own like mini network and named it like the Brown Shirts or something.
And then they had a Jewish hostess.
Oh yeah,
because Anna Kasparian is an Armenian. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like, and again, the Buddhists suffered just as badly. I mean, they were the fourth largest religion in the world by 1900. And it's funny, we don't think of it today, but North Korea, well, it wasn't North Korea then, it was the Chosun Kingdom. But even under the Japanese occupation beginning in 1910, Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of the East because mission work had been so successful in converting it to Christianity. Now, today it seems inconceivable, but that's because state atheism destroyed that institution in much the same way that it destroyed what we saw in Mongolia and Tibet and in China. There was a great movie based off of a book. I think it was called The Long Road, about the three people that escaped from the Gulag in World War II and marched down through Asia into India. And we see the devastation of both. We see blown up and destroyed Christian churches and then blown up Buddhist temples. And we sort of see in Mongolia, not China hadn't gone communist yet. And so we sort of see this devastation, but there's so few of those. We hardly see any movies or documentaries or dramas or books or days of remembrance that discuss this. And you might as well add this as well, the Islam in Central Asia in the 1920s and 30s, the Lenin-Stalin regime brutally repressed the Bosniaki. And of course, one of the young Turks who had led Turkey in World War I died fighting the Bolsheviks in Turkestan. And then we saw later on in the Cold War, Enver Hoxha in Albania and South Yemen and also Afghanistan. And in there as well, mosques were blown up, imams murdered and tortured. And again, that's not talked about either. There really nobody is talking about the massive repression of religion, of all religions, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, by state atheism. Mm-hmm. And I think in part because there are still very influential elements within academia that like the idea of state atheism. And yeah, it failed and it's kind of an embarrassment, but it hasn't suffered. Okay, the failure of Nazism, it has not reached that level of awareness yet. People haven't treated that as the same thing, or the same kind of thing. And of course, I think that's in part why we don't see these other groups discussed that are being victims of it. I mean, one of the things the left is common of saying is there's nothing worse than being a victim and then having your victim experience washed away from history. And all too often, many liberals and socialists are guilty of doing that with regards to Buddhists in East Asia, Christians and Muslims in the Middle East and the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you had the Great Leap Forward in China. And, it's one of the reasons why Buddhist numbers have been so depleted over a number of years, because, one of the biggest homes, especially for Mahayana Buddhism, was China. Then you had the Chinese takeover of Tibet and the fleeing of the Dalai Lama. And, we got the Martin Scorsese movie about it. But also because that somewhat fed American interests. In that, we started to get a little nervous about China. So, here's a guy that China treated like crap. Let's make a movie about it. It's interesting how these things happen so often, that what gets sent out to the culture through the mass media tends to be what is extremely convenient for the powers that be and for the people that have the money, which is one of the more frustrating things to deal with. I think in a lot of ways, it kind of just goes back to that whole, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. What I've always really loved kind of about my sort of religious awakening, and then me beginning to explore my faith and go down the road of a bodhisattva of the earth, which is we can get into that later. But by sort of coming upon Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, coming upon the teachings of Daisaku Ikeda, And then also, encountering Tolstoy and encountering the anarchists and encountering these kind of buried currents of humanity that have sort of been trod beneath the bloody wheels of history, is that, through all of this, we have endured as a species, as an idea. And in a way, it's the Hindus kind of like oftentimes think of the universe actually as a great play, and of each and everything in it is aspects of the Brahman incarnating, which is why like Westerners will go and they'll seek out like a shaman or a guru like on like a mountain in India, and the guru will be looking at them kind of strangely while they're talking to him, and they'll get uncomfortable.
No, not to interrupt. I got to take care of something real quick, but you can keep talking. I'll be right
back. Keep talking? Okay, great. I'll keep talking to our audience here. But anyway, so the guru is looking at them, and they begin to feel uncomfortable, and they're thinking, oh man, this guy is like staring right through me. He's got to see everything that's wrong with me, everything that's terrible, every sin that I've ever committed. And they get extraordinarily uncomfortable, but that's not actually what's happening from the guru's perspective, because the guru's looking at them through a Hindu lens, and really like what it is the guru is like watching friggin' Shiva standing there with a mask being like, hey, and just so lost in the role that it's this like, banker from Sussex talking to them, and he's like, okay, Shiva, yeah, you're doing a really good job with this, and I'm not going to mess with you, but I see you, Mara, to a certain extent. Not that Shiva is Mara, but, seeing through to the ultimate reality, and that can actually cause someone to look at someone fairly strangely. I think the idea of an individual possessing a great deal of spiritual power is something that often makes people very uncomfortable, because we assume that this spiritual power or whatever it is something that we don't possess, and it's something that is alien to us. And I really don't think that that's the case to a certain extent, because I think we kind of overestimate, like we underestimate ourselves a lot of the time, and we overestimate sort of the power of the world around us. Because the world, like as it manifests, is actually taught to be a manifestation of our own internal state. The idea that there is no actual separation between self and other, in much the same way that, if you have a blank piece of paper and you draw a figure on that paper, you couldn't see the figure without the paper, and you couldn't just without the figure, the paper's just white and nothing. So, Todd, you missed a very funny joke involving Shiva. Yeah, involving Shiva pretending to be a banker from Sussex.
Yeah,
so you can go back and look at it.
I'm back now. So, one thing that is also something I think that a lot of people in the United States don't quite understand, this blowback system, is that if you look at the actual plight of Christians in the Middle East, the U.S. escapades since 2001 have only made it worse. And, we say what you want about Assad, Mubarak, and Saddam Hussein. They generally prevented ethnic and religious violence against other groups because it was, from their point of view, destabilizing to their power structure.
Yeah, well, except the Kurds, but yes.
Except the Kurds, yes. But broadly speaking, for example, Tariq Aziz, I think, was an Nestorian Christian within the Saddam regime. And so we see here actually where the existing power structures, as brutal as they might be, are maybe doing the greater good, because having removed them, the Middle East is just blown up. It's like this swirling pot of violence that it wasn't there before. And, that's one aspect that I don't think, again, out of sight, out of mind, right? It's not convenient to report on it. And so people that get most of the news from the media aren't going to hear about it. But I mean, I remember like in 2006, 7, and 8, Euro reports of massive Christian immigration to Syria from Iraq. And now Syria's blown up, and now where are they going to go? It's really bad. For example, more Christians died, Coptic Christians died, after the deposing of Mubarak in like 3 months than died under his like 30-year tenure. It was like the radical Islamic groups just took over, and it exploded in violence against these people.
Well, that's an interesting thing because, there's us, I identify as an anarchist, and, a lot of the time we talk about, the depredations of the state and the terrible things that are often done by those in power. But, I've been listening to, you mentioned Assad. I've actually been listening to this great podcast called Behind the Bastards. They're currently doing like a 2-parter on Assad. But also the same guy who does it, who actually reported on the Robert Evans. He reported on the Ukrainian revolution during Euromaidan, and he went and lived with the PKK YPG in Rojava. And he is doing another podcast, which I highly recommend checking out, called It Could Happen Here, where he talks about the possibilities of a second American Civil War. And one of the things that he mentioned was, when the state, assuming the state does fall, there's going to be a number of groups out there that are looking to immediately take bloody retribution on different groups of people in the United States. Here in the United States, a lot of them are like, white nationalist militias. And the fact is that they actually tried this and did this during the chaos after Katrina. And it's very funny because they're like, they came out and they got in their truck and they said, I want to stop these gang members from looting. And you talk to people who were on the ground there, and the thing was that the gang members were actually some of the most helpful people that they had, and the people who were actually going around murdering and stealing were these like militia groups and essentially drunk rednecks with their weapons. And so, there was an anarchist that was on his podcast recently talking about, how because they were armed, they were able to create a safe area after Katrina. And because of that, they didn't have to shoot anybody. They didn't have to get into like a really serious shootout with these people. But it checked that. And then eventually when the authorities restored order, there were a lot of people alive who might otherwise have not been alive. So yeah, when these structures, when we go into Iraq and topple Saddam, when we go in and, try to, I have no idea what's going on in Syria at this point. It's so confusing. But, when the power of the Assad regime falls, that power vacuum can really unleash a whole lot of ugliness. And, once again, I just keep thinking back to the old adage, homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. And I think
it's sort of like when you said in the Dave stream, when you were on the Cana Society stream, that as bad as the U.S. is, it's probably better than what would replace it should it go down, like say China or Russia. I would argue the same about Saddam, Mubarak, and Assad. As bad as they were, clearly what's replaced them has been worse. I mean, if we look at the amount of people that Saddam killed directly through his wars and through his terrorism of the Kurdish people, we look at how many were killed since then by the intertribal violence and religious violence, and then ISIS. I think we're reaching parity with Saddam Hussein already, probably even exceeding it. And Mubarak and Assad Sr. were thugs, but for example, the Homs massacre, like 20,000 people died. Yeah, that's terrible. But how many people have died in the Syrian civil war? Like almost 100,000. So it's almost like, as bad as Homs was, it sort of like showed that the regime was not going to put up with this sort of terrorist violence because it was against, I think, Islamic Jihad.
And that's kind of what I talk about when I say you can't escape karma. And I see this a lot on the left, because you mentioned, like, there's people who make a lot of guillotine jokes. It's kind of the leftist version of people who make, helicopter rides jokes. And there's this idea that a lot of people get into, and I think it's an aspect of being in a lower life condition, having your head in a more savage place, and they begin to think that they can kill their way to a better world. And obviously that's not the case. Like, you look at the French Revolution, you look at the Russian Revolution, you look at this, when you do tear down these structures in this way, you deal with the fallout. And I mean, even look at the Civil War. I can't think of a more justified war to a certain extent than the American Civil War, because freaking chattel slavery. Obviously it's not black and white like that, but as far as wars go, that's pretty black and white. That's up there with like World War II against Hitler. But even now, look at the ripple effects that are happening down the line, and then you look and maybe we get another American Civil War. Maybe we get
real quick. One obvious ripple effect was the warning that Robert E. Lee gave. He said that the federal government would be despotic at home and imperialist abroad. And then
he's totally right.
That's exactly what happened. Robert E. Lee. This is one of his last letters. I think he died in 1870. And the Lincoln regime. And again, this is something else the left is really bad at. Is the Indian Wars, the Great Plains, where they criticized the Union Army for these atrocities. The Civil War was the training ground for everything that would later happen to the Sioux and the Comanche and all these other tribes out on the Great Plains. And for that matter, what happened to the Filipinos in the Philippine insurrection. The Civil War was the training period where these tactics were tried, perfected. And once that cauldron had perfected those strategies, they were then implemented across the world. And that's just something I think that should be obvious, especially since Sherman, Grant, and Sheridan all made allusions to that explicitly, that, yeah, we're only doing to the Indians what we did to Richmond and Vicksburg. I mean, why are you guys surprised about this?
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing, like the concentration camp, I think, was invented by the Spanish and was brought about primarily, I think, in the Spanish-American Civil War, or in the Civil War.
Well, there was the Cuban Revolution that precipitated the Spanish-American War, but that's when they implemented it, yes.
Yeah. And then, I think Hitler actually said that he based a lot of his tactics during the Holocaust on the American laws during the Jim Crow era. I think it was Jim Crow.
Well, not only that, the Spanish military governor, Wheeler, admitted that he was inspired by Sherman. He's like, you Americans, I'm only doing what Sherman did to Georgia. Why are you so upset? I'm doing the same thing. Because again, you create this precedent, you create this, the ends don't justify the means.
They absolutely do not.
And what ends up happening is the methods the Union used to win they created, a cockatrice that just grew and spread, not just how we treated the United States government treated other nations it conquered, but it gave other nations the green light to go. So Spain goes one step further. It says, oh, well, we're going to do that. Or like when Prussia is besieging Paris in 1871, General Sheridan is the observer, the U.S. observer, and he says to the Prussians, oh, you're treating the French with silk gloves. You got to leave them only with their eyes to weep over the destruction. And again, when the Germans do what we did to Belgium, to Belgium, we did that to the South and the Indians. So how is, the ripple effect of that is the Americans basically say it's okay, except when somebody else does it. And everybody else says, well, maybe we should do the same thing.
The Americans, yeah.
Like the Americans or the British, because at the time, they were doing things like that as well. So, we were setting the standard for this behavior. And then when other people do it, we say, no, you're bad. And they're like, well, wait, we're doing what you just did. You can't turn around.
I learned it from watching you.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the things that, a lot of people have a hard time seeing. So liberals will look at the Civil War and say, well, the cause was just. But then they'll tend to ignore how that victory was achieved. And a lot of the long-term.
And how many of those liberals are secular? Think about that.
That too.
What I talked about with fundamental darkness, they do not notice the ripple effect. They get locked into this particular thing of this particular body in this particular time, and it just ends.
Yes.
And it doesn't. It very clearly doesn't. And I think in a lot of ways, that's maybe what is trying to be expressed sometimes when people say, you can't be ethical without religion. It's not so much that, there can't be someone who is ethical and secular. And I actually think the whole religious secular is a false dichotomy, in my opinion. Because I don't think it's a good idea to separate the spiritual from the material. There is no difference between what is sacred and what is profane is a matter of opinion, of how you feel about it. the god in the grove and that kind of thing. But you'll notice that when you do get into this very particular Western secular mindset, you begin to think of history in little chunks. And we overthrew the British and everything's fine. And then we defeated the South in the Civil War and everything was fine. And they guillotined all of the French aristocracy and everything is fine. And again, it's clearly not the case. So
exactly. Another really good example would be as it applies to socialists. So they'll look at the Soviet Union and say, yeah, go Lenin. Yeah, you had to have the Cheka. Yeah, you had to expropriate peasants' grain. But it was all for the greater. Think of like Michael Parenti, the case in point. It's like, well, they had to defeat Hitler. What were they going to do? Or they had to fend off the Western capitalists who had invaded in 1919. They had to resort to these harsh measures. But here's the point. Richard Pipes, to refer back to him, the Soviet Union was a blueprint for all 20th century totalitarian regimes. It was a blueprint for Mussolini. It was a blueprint for Mustafa Kemal. It was a blueprint for Chiang Kai-shek and Hitler and Mao and all of these other applications that socialists would balk at, saying, well, that's not real socialism. They were all inspired by Lenin's dictatorship. And so, again, even if you think the Soviet Union was justified from the socialist perspective of abolishing feudal czarism, the methods, of course, literally bit them in the ass because other groups appropriated it who had a different value set than they did. And then they had to suffer. Maybe that's the karma you're talking about, right? The karma of bringing the Nazi invasion was the karmic cycle fulfilling itself because of what they had to do to set it up. Or you could argue that in China, the nationalist regime uses methods not quite as brutal as the Soviets, but similar. And then Japan invades. And then the communist Chinese set up the system. And then they have all the purges.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
No, I think you're entirely right. And, it's almost like I've talked about violence in a Buddhist standpoint, like almost like a autoimmune disease, where the body attacks itself, where it's like the cells in your body just suddenly start going to war with each other and everything would be fine if they just leave it alone. And I think that is one way of thinking about reality. And what it comes down to, it's funny because we were talking about Sherman a little bit ago, and Caleb Maupin did a debate with Augustus Sol Invictus about communism versus fascism. And I was in the background and I kind of made fun of Augustus Sol Invictus pretty hard towards the end. But afterwards I was talking with him and I was kind of apologizing because I felt a little crappy for sort of ambushing him with that. Like he was begging for it, but still. And I brought up that because he'd talked a lot about Robert E. Lee and the Statue of Lee, and this was right before Unite the Right. And as a means of sort of apology with it, I came up and I said, there is a giant golden statue of Sherman in Central Park being pulled by angels. And, I think the Statue of Lee should come down, and I think the Statue of Sherman should come down. And I remember in Sol Invictus was like, I'm a huge fan of Sherman. And Lee. Like, it's like he loved just anybody that killed a bunch of people, which if you read some of his writing, I asked him if he was a serial killer, and I'm still kind of thinking maybe he might be. Well,
I mean, right, Sol Invictus was the unconquerable sun god, and that's why the Romans worshipped him, because the Romans believed that Sol Invictus gave them power to conquer. One of the things that I think we would agree is that those positive changes that are the most long-lasting are those that have come through consent and peaceful means. So for example, the general elevation of the value of human life that Christianity brought, I would argue largely happened in spite of the excesses of Christendom, because saying one thing and doing exactly the opposite is a really bad way to sell the message. It's the work of the people at the ground who actually live out treating people as if, they were Christ. Christ says, if you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. And, over the millennia, people doing that, it changes the consciousness. And even if you're not a Christian, it's a better way to live. And non-Christians will admit it's a better way to live, and they'll copy that. And
it's very similar to Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and also the socialist concept of an injury to one is an injury to all. I think, what is it they say in the Bible when after Cain has murdered Abel, and God says, where's your brother? And he's like, am I my brother's keeper? And I think one of the big lessons of, Christian and also like the history of humanity is, yeah, we are our brother's keeper.
Basically, Cain was a libertarian.
That's really funny.
I couldn't resist that because, right, they have no positive obligations, right?
No, certainly not. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just you stay off my lawn, you weirdo. But this was something that's very inherent in Buddhist philosophy. And what so there's a story about this golden Buddha. It's a Buddha made of gold in a temple somewhere. And they hear that an army is coming through. And they're like, oh man, this army's going to come through. It's going to ransack. It's going to steal the golden Buddha and chop it up because it's gold. So what happens is that the monks go and they cover the Buddha in this layer of like mud and earth. And suddenly it looks like a normal statue. And the army comes and they stay in the area for a really long time and they kill like all the monks and everything. And so it gets to a point where no one remembers that Buddha is gold until one day, people have sort of repopulated the temple and there's a monk kind of just sitting there chanting, and he rings a bell or hits the statue or just kind of brushes at some dust, and suddenly boom, 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 and you see the gold. And he's just like, the Buddha's gold. And that the metaphor of that whole story is to talk about like the inherent Buddha nature inside of us, but also to talk about, I think, the nature of the world that we live in, because we've talked about, to bring it back to the Pure Land Buddhists, the reason they think that you get salvation through Amida Buddha, which is a Buddha, not a real Buddha. Like, I mean, it's a mythological idea as opposed to a person, because Buddha said that if you died chanting specific things about the Buddha, you would awaken in the Pure Land, which was this kind of world, this like heaven realm without strife. And so it's very similar to Christianity. You get your salvation through Jesus, you find yourself in heaven. So that, as far as Nichiren Buddhists take it, and one of the reasons why we have big conflicts with the Pure Land is the Pure Land of the Buddha is not somewhere else. It's not somewhere that we can't get to or that we need to be magically. It's here right now where we are. The problem is we don't recognize it because we are fooled by fundamental darkness, because we're fooled by Maya and Mara. And I think that for humanity, in a big way, we kind of have to realize that in a secular sense, that if anything is going to wipe us out on this planet, if anything is going to continue to cause misery, we've pretty much tamed the planet. We're not going to get killed by tigers and leopards. We're going to get killed by each other, either in warfare or by destroying the world around us. And there are so many things going on right now. There's such an abundance of food. There's such an abundance of material comfort and things that could be shared in medical advances. And we are so scared that we don't let people have these because we're afraid that favors will not be returned. We're afraid that our neighbors will not follow through on the obligation to be their brother's keeper. And what I would say is, and this is sort of where I want to end my sort of thing in here, is that I said that, yes, we are our brother's keeper. And what's important is that if enough of us can take that leap of faith, then we will find ourselves in heaven, either in heaven in the Christian sense, where we take the leap of faith and therefore are transported to the kingdom of God. In the Tolstoyan sense, the kingdom of God is within you, or in the Buddhist sense, the heaven realm is nirvana is samsara.
Well, I think we might need to end here. We've been going an hour and a half. We can certainly have future conversations, but I don't want to go too long because then people lose interest in the discussion. So do you want to take that as your last statement to wrap this up for tonight?
Yep. And you can make your last statement.
I was just going to say it. Thanks for coming on. This was a really interesting interfaith dialogue, to use the vernacular. Yeah. So, thanks again for coming on, Brent. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.